Okay, so overview of our course. Just want to kind of always call us back to where we are. We began the history last week. We will continue with history. We're going to pick it up where we left off last time because I want to have a conversation about how some of the things that were happening in the 50s have led to some of the things that are happening today. So we'll pick up sort of at the end of where we were last week. And my hope is that we're going to get into the 2000s and have time to finish up with a discussion amongst ourselves about kind of who we are as a nation, who we understand ourselves to be, who the world understands us to be at this time in our life. So, uh, so this is week 3. Again, I said this in the email. If you miss a week, we're trying to make sure that by the beginning of the week we've got the recording sent out. Both Tim and I were out of town this week, and he sent it from vacation because he's a great guy. Because I have some thing with the Tithely, which holds our registrations, and I can't get in to get your emails. And there were still people signing up until this week. So now I have a full list and we'll be all set and I can send you stuff. Okay, week 4 next week, we will really talk about what's happening today. The movement that started in the continuation of the movement that started really back in the late 70s, but has morphed into what we see in front of us, and I'm guessing what brings most of us here. And then week 5, we're going to talk about what we can do. What is our response to Christian nationalism in our midst? And the first thing you can do is to learn what you can about it. So congratulations, you've already done a thing. All right, 1950s. We did do this last week, so I'm not going to go through it slowly. 1953, we had the first national prayer breakfast. It was called the Presidential Prayer Breakfast. The theme was Government Under God. 1954 was the Brown versus Board of Education decision that said we cannot have separate but equal schools, that we needed to stop separating children at school. This decision plays into things that happen all the way through the 70s and 80s. 1954, we add Under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. Remember, the Pledge of Allegiance was written in 1892. Wasn't until the 50s that someone said, oh, we must have Under God in the pledge. 69% of Americans. What had happened just before this, 10 years before this?
World War II?
World War II. So we're coming out of World War II. People are shaken. The Cold War is in full swing by 1954. People are terrified about the godless communistic menace. And so their response is to say, yes, we need to be more godful. And this is how we'll do it. We'll put things on the money and we'll put it in the pledge. And so you only have 21% of people opposing adding Under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. More Protestants than Catholics, though. So this sort of evangelical movement, and I'm going to call it evangelical, even though this is a lot of mainline Protestants making these decisions. But the fervor is small e evangelical. And again, Catholics are kind of standing over to the side on this stuff. July 1955, we add In God We Trust to all the money. Remember, that was a movement that started in the Civil War, but it wasn't really codified until 1955. We still have In God We Trust on all our money. It then becomes the motto of the United States, the national motto of the US. Worth noting that these, again, are mainline Protestants spearheading these decisions, not what we think of now as capital E evangelicals. And I'm going to read you this real quick because then I want to talk about what it is that Doherty said. I read it at the very end last week, but I want you to hear it again. This is Reverend George Doherty, New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, talking about the need to add Under God to the pledge. Keep in mind again, end of World War II, beginning of the Cold War. Doherty declares that the current pledge has something missing, right, without Under God. And it could be uttered by atheistic Russians. In fact, I could hear little Muscovites repeat a similar pledge to their hammer and sickle flag in Moscow with equal solemnity, for Russia is also a republic that claims to have overthrown the tyranny of kingship. Doherty then claims that in the US, we face today, listen to this language, we face today a theological war. It is Armageddon, a battle of the gods. It is the view of man as it comes down to us from Judeo-Christian civilization in mortal combat against modern, secularized, godless humanity. To omit the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance is to omit the definitive character of the American way of life. And that quote is in Kaler and Underwood, which is Baptizing America, the book that's about mainline Protestants and Christian nationalism. Okay, so let's talk about this. And let's not do breakout rooms because not everybody likes breakout rooms. I learned the first time that we did that. So let's just talk. Go ahead and unmute. Tim is not here. So go ahead and unmute and speak because I can't see all of you. And if I try to see all of you, then it won't let me advance the slides. So, have you heard any language like this lately? And or, how is fear being weaponized in this sermon from Reverend Doherty?
So language that I've heard like this, just in the last couple of days, there's been this whole conversation about Venezuelan immigrants and how all of them are automatically part of the gang. And most frightening that even if they don't have a record, that doesn't mean they're not dangerous. And in fact, they might be more dangerous because we don't have enough information on them to know who they really are if they don't have a criminal record. So that kind of, we're in a war, we're facing Armageddon, we're under invasion kind of thing. So that kind of answers both questions, but that's what's jumping at me right now is something that I've heard about that sounds like this.
Thanks, Megan.
Well, the speaker mentions, compares it to Russia, or you could also compare it to the other end of it, because I think, Iraq, right, where you've got a religiously led country, where the laws are based on an interpretation of the Quran, and so you can compare it to lots of different things.
Sure.
And if you don't agree with it, you're neither Christian nor American nor worth anything.
Yeah, hear that binary, right? It's us and them.
I hear the term American way of life. And what is that? I mean, that's like an awful term, except that's what people keep saying, this American way of life.
And the term, that secularized, godless humanity, secular humanism is a term that's being thrown around by Christian nationals that's like, oh, they are horrible. You're just wanting us to be secular humanists. And I'm like, okay, I don't think that's what's going on, but sure. Right?
How is fear being weaponized in this sermon?
I think in this instance, it's pretty much the same as today. It still comes down to that overall thing of fear of the other, something that is somehow different. And many times, if it isn't even that different, because I think we all share a certain co-humanity, there will be ways of making it seem different.
Mm-hmm.
You said, Donna, this was 1954,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah. So, I mean, during that time, excuse me, you're coming out of World War II in Korea, and then there's this call to continue to defend what we fought for. All of our soldiers or our people died for certain freedoms. And so there was so much language during that time in particular that was centered on, we have a battle to fight in order to reconcile what our soldiers died for, and God is on our side. So it's like a continuation of that kind of rhetoric, like that wartime rhetoric. And this is of course then what leads us into Vietnam also, and all of that. It's a continuation of that kind of rhetoric, and it's using God as the driver.
Mm-hmm.
Well, don't forget either that we are at war in Korea. This was during the Korean War period that the things in 54 apply to more than Vietnam. And there you had the images of these masses of Chinese communists pouring down from the north. And it was a scary time in many respects. I mean, I was, in grade school at that time, and we were practicing all of those things about defending because the bombs were going to fall, and we didn't live very far from Omaha and Offutt Air Force Base, and so we had to practice for being blown away. And it was the use of fear is a very powerful thing.
I'm looking at the language just in the quote, and I see war, battle, combat, Armageddon, like all close to each other.
Look in the hymnal from 1940 something or other, the Lutheran hymnal for the Missouri Synod. You have, not that those hymns aren't around, but boy, we certainly sang a lot of onward Christian soldiers, and the Son of God goes forth to war. And I don't know, there's a number of others that used that military language.
Yeah, even a mighty fortress is our God.
Yep. It is.
But why have we so weaponized immigration and DEI? I don't understand that.
They're different. They don't fit the typical U.S. mentality mold of what a U.S. citizen should be.
Right. I was just going to say it's fear of the other.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, Megan. This sermon otherizes. There's you and somebody else, and you better win, because that other is going to take over you.
And in this case, the other then is white Christian men somehow.
Or the we is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of this being preached today.
Yeah.
A lot.
Yep. Well, that's a good segue.
You're welcome.
So you've seen this slide before. That is the Deus Vult flag that is often carried in white supremacist rallies. That flag comes from the First Crusade, and it is carried now by people who believe that we are now in a new crusade. So where have we seen this language lately? There's some.
And God wills it somehow. Yes.
God chose Trump to save the USA.
Yes.
Those are Chinese nationals. There's a surprisingly large group of Chinese nationals at January 6th because of anti-communism. So there's a little group of folks, I mean, small comparatively, who are there to just say fight the Chinese fight the CCP, I think is it CCP? But they're kind of there just to stand up for anti-communism. Here's a book a guy wrote, Making Stories Great Again, Episode 1, Donald Trump versus Armageddon, the End of the World. And Lauren Boebert, representing the great state of Colorado. It's time for us to position ourselves to rise up and take our place in Christ and influence this nation as we were called to do. We know that we are in the last of the last days. You get to have a role in ushering in the second coming of Jesus.
You know what's interesting is her first sentence, actually, I could agree with. She's right. We need to do what Jesus commanded. That's not what she's thinking.
Yes, you all don't agree on what that means, but
yeah, but we need to influence this nation by showing love.
Yeah.
But that's the marketing piece of it, is that you do agree with the first part, right? And so you're listening. It's like, oh, yeah, we do. And so at what point does it get too far away from what you believe?
Right. It's in when you get to have a role in ushering it. I don't think the Bible says that anywhere.
Right. Isn't that just the worst? Maybe it's not the worst part, but this.
No, it's not the worst.
But this whole movement takes Jesus, like we become the saviors. It is so heretical and it is so
idolatry.
I am not a savior of this country, and neither is Donald Trump, and neither is anyone else. And we have no role in bringing Jesus Christ back to earth. We don't know the day and the time. And that, I'm sorry, I'm gonna be quiet now.
No, you're in good company. Who's at First Lutheran who had a hand up? That actually popped up for me.
I was looking at the chat and I didn't mean to raise my hand. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Is there something in the chat that we should know about?
No, I was just reading it. Something flashed up there, so I picked the wrong one.
Kim said she has seen that the cross on Pete Hegseth's body. He has a giant tattoo of
the
Crusaders
Vault.
Yeah.
Yes, he does. That was actually in the piece from that website. It's on your bibliography, the website that collected all of the Christian imagery from January 6th. Not thinking of the name of it right off the top of my head, but yes, that was in that Pete Hegseth has that tattoo. Someone said, Jill, was that you? We're hearing the same language that we heard in Reverend Doherty's sermon today.
Yeah, sure, we'll go with that.
It was you or Megan. So here we have little children saying the Pledge of Allegiance and including under God, and here we have liberty, maybe that's $1. And in God we trust. It seems very benign, right? But do you know the Arab parable about the camel's nose? Once you let the camel's nose into the tent, then the whole darn camel's going to be in there. It's a nice little affectation of speech. So you just say these little adorable kids saying the pledge and having a simple phrase on our money in many ways becomes the camel's nose in the tent, because you hear people all the time when they speak of these kinds of I don't even know what to call that. When they make these kinds of statements, they draw it back to, we're the nation that has in God we trust on our money. We're the nation that stands up and pledges to the flag and says that this nation lives under God. So that they're simple, benign events, but as we continue to mythologize them through history to the point where then we all of a sudden have a system where people are saying absolutely surprising things because they can say Judeo-Christian nation, right?
Donna,
Mm-hmm.
regarding Lauren's statement, I'm sorry, I can't seem to find the raise hand. I keep looking through all the icons at the
It's
bottom.
okay. Well, yeah, you if you raise your hand, it seems like it brings you over so I can see you. So it's in sorry, go ahead, Andrea, and I'll find it.
I was just gonna say, I heard this years ago, and I don't remember if it was in one of our PMA training classes. I think it was more like in a public speaking class or writing, that talked about in every good lie, there is a kernel of truth, which is, you know, what she was just saying. The whole first statement is very true, and we all should do it, but then when it gets twisted, and so it's that taking that kernel of truth and then twisting it that becomes the problem.
And we find ourselves sitting there nodding along, and then all of a sudden realizing that we're agreeing to Armageddon.
And it doesn't recognize that there are other people who are other than Christian, who are part of this nation. And that it also doesn't take into consideration the importance of the cross for each of us, and what that cross means if we are willing to give our lives for the sake of others.
Right, right.
The theology of glory.
It is the theology of glory. That's right.
There's a we here that I think she intends to mean the entire, well, I don't think she does intend to mean the entire country, but it's rhetorically it's presented as if she's speaking for the whole country.
Mm-hmm.
This we that is in fact consciously trying to bring about the last days. And yes, it leaves out more people than it includes, but it's structured to feel as if it's a universal.
Or is
Part of this,
or is it structured? I don't know that it's structured to be universal. I think it's structured to be elitist. We know that we're in the last days. You don't know it, but we know it, right? I get it. I'm reading it as no, there are elite few that are included in this, and if you don't get on board, it is the Left Behind series, right? If you're not on board with this, you're just going to be left behind.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, it's functioning on a couple of levels. It's certainly, I sincerely doubt that any of us in the room feel included in the last two statements here. And maybe you do, and that's fine.
I think a lot of this too comes from the fear as this nation becomes less and less Christian and much more secular. So there's that maybe if we don't rise up now and do something, we won't be able to in 10 or 20 years. There will be too few of us.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
And when people say that to me, I wonder then, if this is truly a free nation, then we shouldn't have that fear. We should be able to believe that we get to practice our religion the way we want to practice our religion. But the fear is because we often oppress minorities. And so there is a history of oppressing minorities. So we know that if we become minority, we are going to be oppressed, right? That's where the fear comes from. They recognize, and I'm sorry I'm using the word they, I try not to, but people who believe this recognize that for the time we have been, well, let's just say for the entirety of the world, minorities have been oppressed and taken advantage of and not given their rights. And so instead of making it so that everyone gets to not be oppressed, we make it so that we're afraid because we know what's coming.
And that's the language that is used in all of this rhetoric too. We Christians are being oppressed. The oppression of Christians is real. We don't have rights anymore. And you hear that language over and over again, right?
We can't even say Merry Christmas anymore.
And there has been kind of a department established to counter oppression of Christians. So from the top, this is something that is being put out there. I think for me, a piece of the fear comes from, I was talking to somebody in my congregation about this recently, feeling not knowing, not having a sense of how big our God is. And so we kind of feel like if God is at work, this is what it looks like. It's something we can identify. We're going to hear these kinds of statements. We're going to see, this kind of practice, and not realizing just how big our God is. And that, yes, it's true. Christianity has a lot fewer followers than it used to. Yes, we have fewer members in our churches, we have fewer congregations. That doesn't mean that God isn't at work. We just might need to be expanding our vision to see how God is today. How God might be where God might be leading us into the future. And it doesn't have to look like what it looked like in the past. But that's a really scary thing, I think. So I think that's a piece of where this fear comes from as well. Is just this sense of, I don't understand where God is right now, and I don't see how we can possibly be okay if God isn't showing up the way I'm used to seeing God show up.
So I want to read a kind of longish. This is about 4 slides. This is from a piece that you may have seen go by if you engage social media, because the Atlantic is, I don't know about you, it's always in my feed, and maybe you don't have an Atlantic subscription. There was a David Brooks, who again is he calls himself a centrist. Most people agree he's sort of center right, certainly not a left-wing radical. Wrote a piece recently, a couple years ago, called When America Turned Mean. And this is from that. And I think it is a piece that we want to bring in as we're talking about who the we is and who the they is, and how we managed to split after World War II so neatly into some of these binary not that it wasn't happening before. I mean, we have a long history of otherizing groups of people, but there are some things that David Brooks attaches to communal shifts that are happening. So I'm going to read this. The crucial pivot happened just after World War II, as people wrestled with the horrors of the 20th century. One group, personified by the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, argued that recent events had exposed the prevalence of human depravity and the dangers in particular of tribalism, nationalism, and collective pride. This group wanted to double down on moral formation with a greater emphasis on humility. They lost. Another group, personified by Carl Rogers, a founder of humanistic psychology, focused on the problem of authority. The trouble with the 20th century, the members of this group argued, was that the existence of rigid power hierarchies led to oppression in many spheres of life. We need to liberate individuals from these authority structures. Many contended. People are naturally good and can be trusted to do their own self-actualization. There was a time I believed that. The Atlantic cluster of phenomenally successful books that appeared in the decade after World War II, making the case that, as Rabbi Joshua Liebman wrote in Peace of Mind, thou shalt not be afraid of thy hidden impulses. It's not a whole sentence. People can trust the goodness inside. His book topped the New York Times bestseller list for 58 weeks. Dr. Spock's first child-rearing manual was published in the same year. That was followed by books like The Power of Positive Thinking. According to this ethos, morality is not something that we develop in communities. It's nurtured by connecting with our authentic self and finding our true inner voice. From the start, some worried about this privatizing of morality. If what is good, what is right, what is true is only what the individual chooses to invent, Walter Lippmann wrote in his 1955 collection, Essays in the Public Philosophy, then we are outside the traditions of civility. His book was hooted down by establishment figures such as the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. The demoralization of American culture is underway. Okay, this is David Brooks, and you may think that he's being a bit over the top, but what are the dangers of privatizing or personalizing morality? And think about, if you don't want to think about the 1950s, think about last week. Oh. And we're only going to take like 5 minutes because I've got so many slides. But I do want to get to this question. I think this question is a really important thread to pull with us as we get closer to today.
I think at the end of Judges, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
Ah.
The problem is that oftentimes inflicts on others what I think is right. Not only you should think that's right, but what I think is right and good for me may be detrimental to someone else.
We lose a common ground of values.
Mm-hmm.
If we go too far into this. So where is that? I think the question for me is, where is the line? How do we find a common ground of values in the midst of recognizing diversity and plurality?
Mm-hmm.
Have we ever had a one understanding of morality in this country? Has there ever been that time?
I think we pretended we did in the 50s.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
well.
I think there were
and yet people of color were
right.
Sure.
Okay. I'm
We're
just
not
asking, I'm sorry, I'm just asking.
No, and on the face of it, this is what's really interesting about this and why I chose it. On the face of it, none of this sounds terrible. Asking people to be true to themselves and to check in with themselves about what they think is right and wrong is not deeply problematic until we realize that we've removed all the guardrails.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, Donna. They're guardrails. I think the common morality is the guardrails, and I'm putting it in the terms of why are the 10 Commandments a blessing is because they're a guide rail system to, to loving God and loving neighbor. And they're basic ways we do that, right? It doesn't get into the details, but in basic language, don't kill other people. Seems pretty common.
But then to Jane's point, sticking them up on a courthouse wall does not mean that everyone walks around thinking, I'm going to perform exactly like that.
Exactly.
Because that's I mean, most folks will agree with most of what's in the 10 Commandments.
It's Hammurabi's code too, right?
Right.
I mean,
it's not simply a Judeo-Christian set of rules. But then we tokenize it by saying, well, if we just stuck this everywhere.
And we individualize it too, right? Because of course, then we filter it through our own interpretation. And you shall not kill means you shouldn't murder, but I can, kill in this situation, it's fine, right? And so you start splitting the moral hairs.
Only if you get on my lawn. Okay, sorry to move along. And if you had a brilliant point, just yell it out. All right. So here's the other thing that happens in the mid-50s. 1954 May, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that the separate but equal schools sanctioned by Plessy versus Ferguson way back are not constitutional. So schools must be integrated. I know we all know this. It is hard to overemphasize how important a decision this is for this country. June 26th, not much longer, not long after this, Senator Harry Byrd, of Virginia, and the Byrd Organization vowed to prevent integration of schools in Virginia and beyond. The campaign comes to be called Massive Resistance. It created deliberate obfuscation of segregation efforts into the 1970s, and we're going to see this play out as we continue. Starting in 1954, what are called segregation academies are formed all over the country to take advantage of the fact that private schools at this time can still be racially segregated. So you get little signs like this that are stuck up all over the place. Quit worrying about which public school your child may be compelled to attend next year. Let us explain how you can get a first-class private education at a modest cost. Stonewall Jackson Academy. Sorry, it's really hard to say that without laughing. Christian parents of Tyler, I think this is Tyler, Texas, have a vital interest in the Tyler Christian Junior High School. Come to the public meeting, Texas room, there you go. Blackstone Hotel, Thursday, December 10th, 7:30 p.m. Here, Reverend L.T. Van Horn, Presbyterian minister and educator. Again, if you know Presbyterians, some of the things that we see them attached to back in this history will surprise you. So Tyler, Texas, hometown of our beloved Patrick Mahomes. All right, so American greatness often tracked back to the 1950s. We talk about when was America great? A lot of people will say, well, the 50s. Things were great. And what that does is to racialize and code in other ways that language of greatness, right? If the 1950s were when America was great, what does that mean for everyone? Anybody want to weigh in, or you want me to just read my point?
I'd say
Straight and
pre-16.
white, good.
Yeah.
I'd say pre-1600, there was greatness.
Yeah. You know, you'd be right there. Or as far by my knowledge of history, yeah, it'd be closer. So sure, I mean, if you say America was great in the 1950s, it's a great video. If you, the Daily Show sent all of its correspondents out. They send Jordan Klepper out all the time to these rallies, but they sent all their correspondents out to ask people at rallies, when was America great? You know, they'd say things. A lot of them said the 50s, and they'd say, oh, so like before the Civil Rights Movement, and folks were having to confront. Yeah, America was great as long as you were white and straight and mostly male. It pops up on Facebook all the time. A woman couldn't get a credit card until 1973. So this is a pretty actually small segment of the American population who have unlimited rights and freedoms back in the 50s. But when people say, let's make America great, it's usually this era that they're thinking about. Because here's what happens. The 1960s are, according to one author, I can't remember which one it is, the end of the era of moral clarity. And with a bang, right? The Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War. We were the heroes in World War II, and then we went into Korea, and then the Vietnam War is a whole other thing. And we're going to talk about Iraq and Afghanistan if we can get to it today, if not next week, and how this sort of moral clarity erodes and erodes and erodes. Fights for equality for women, for sexual minorities, and others all cast doubt upon the moral clarity of the 1950s. It's in some ways a pendulum a pendulum shift. That's the word. The critiques inherent in these movements bothered religious conservatives, right? Religious conservatives did not like the 60s. They did not like the hippie movement. They did not like the anti-Vietnam War movement. They did not want to talk about equality for women. I am now painting them all with a huge broad brush, but I feel fairly confident. They saw support for the U.S. as a theological mandate. So all of these things are not only pushing against society, they're pushing against what it is for us to be the United States of America. We are not the place where everyone is equal, even though it kind of says that. All right, if you put something in the chat and you want everybody to hear it, unmute and say it.
Well, I was just going to say, wasn't it like the late 60s and early 70s when the Jesus movement started? I'm not clear on a lot of that history, but it seems like that's like in California, there was this
attempt to sort of carve out a part that a bridge, right, between these movements for more equality against the moral problems with the Vietnam War and Christianity. And that's when you get Godspell, and that's when you get Jesus Christ Superstar, and you get folks that are saying, no, it doesn't have to be Christianity over there. And we're in one of those clarifying periods now, right? Because what some of our neighbors think is Christianity is abhorrent. So yeah, important point. Thank you, Ashley.
It was also the sexual revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. They didn't much like that either.
Yeah, no, they didn't.
Birth control also comes in the 60s and brings incredible freedom to whom?
Ladies.
Yeah. There was a conference, we're going to come to it in a second. There was a conference held in 1968 to talk about abortion, but it was also to talk about birth control, because those two things seemed connected to folks, because it was all about having the right to control what happened with your body. All right, initially thought evangelicals, I think that's supposed to be though, evangelicals like Jerry Falwell were not overtly interested in engaging in national politics. So back at this time, they're building their movements, they're doing their preaching, they're not really interfacing much with the political system, with the exception of Billy Graham, who, as we've spoken about before, is not as far out to the edge as the Jerry Falwells and the Pat Robertsons. You know, Jerry Falwell, or Billy Graham really tried to stay close to the center. He had his own stuff that was just born in the 40s and 50s, and it was the same stuff everybody else had. I sent you this article, and hopefully you had a chance to read it. It's not very long. It's a political article, so political sits a little bit to the left, not all that far. But this is a really good article about what they call the myth, and lots of others also call the myth, that what caused white evangelicals to coalesce as a political movement was Roe versus Wade. And our historical shorthand now says that evangelicals came together because they were so upset about Roe. So here's what actually happened. In 1968, August 27th to the 31st, Christianity Today, which is a magazine started by JF, and the Christian Medical Association host a conference on abortion and birth control, as I said. A joint statement is released, which reads in part, "Whether the performance of an induced abortion is sinful, we are not agreed. But about the necessity of it and permissibility for it under certain circumstances, we are in accord." And there is nothing said through Jerry Falwell, who comes out as a huge opponent of abortion, doesn't preach his first sermon about abortion until 1977. Roe versus Wade was 73. A lot of evangelicals came out actually in support of the right of women to have abortions if they chose. So here's what's happening at the same time. It's so much. 1971, There are several court cases. There are 2 in 71, and there's another one in 76. Green versus Connolly and Coit versus Green are the cases in which the Supreme Court rules that a private school which discriminates on the basis of race, right, these are the segregation academies that we looked at earlier, cannot be considered tax exempt, and that donations to such a school would not be tax deductible. This decision is what mobilized the Christian right, and the person who actually has divulged that information is a guy called Paul Weyrich, who's sort of the author of The Current Religious Right. And he has, for some reason, let people look at his papers. And he clearly outlines that people were furious about these decisions about the segregation academies, and furious that the Supreme Court and the United States government would tell them that they had to admit Black students. And Weyrich is quite upfront about the fact that is what caused a movement to form. So they become even more infuriated in 1978 when poor Jimmy Carter directed his IRS to enforce the law. So the law comes in 1971. There's another law in 76. Is it on here? No. We'll get to it in a second. There's another law in 76, Runyon, that also, in a different way, states that you can't be a private school. It is literally illegal. This is not about tax status. This is about legality, that a school cannot say, we will not accept Black students. So Bob Jones University is the kind of center point in this whole story. Bob Jones University, until 1971, refused to admit African-American students at all. They got some pressure, and there were the 2 rulings in 71, right, saying you won't be tax exempt if you don't admit Black students. So from 71 to 75, they said, okay, we will take African-American students. They have to be married, and they have to be married to other African Americans. Then in 75, they started admitting unmarried African Americans, but they cannot be in interracial marriages because Bob Jones University has determined that the Bible forbids interracial mingling. This policy stood at Bob Jones until 2000. You may remember when they finally lifted this policy that you couldn't be in an interracial marriage. Their tax exempt status is revoked in 1976. Though the whole thing is kind of a funny story. If you want to read it, they were charged like $29 for tax, and then they took the government to court, and the government said, okay, well then you owe us since 1971, and we want $400,000. And they worked it all out. Their tax exempt status was revoked in 76. Series of court cases and appeals that last until 1983. The Supreme Court votes 8-1 that Bob Jones University is not protected by the First Amendment. They're trying to argue that the separation of church and state gives them the right to be segregationists. And the Supreme Court said no, that it doesn't. There was some counter argument in this movement. There were a couple of Supreme Court justices through this period who were concerned that if we said no public organization could discriminate, that it could create a problem for things like historic Black fraternities, who would then have to admit white people to their fraternity. So where you sometimes the no votes are people who have other concerns. All right, everybody doing all right? How are we doing on time? All right. 1973, the Supreme Court rules in Roe versus Wade that the Constitution protects a woman's right to an abortion until fetal viability. 1976 is the Runyon ruling. These things are connected. The Runyon ruling that private schools which discriminate on the basis of race are actually in violation of federal law. So not only are they not tax exempt, they're illegal. This would close all of the segregation academies that opened after Brown versus the Board of Education and said, your kids can come here. And in 1978, as we saw earlier, the Carter administration orders the IRS to enforce the prior rulings. Now think about the next election. You have a sitting president. He is, at that time, a Southern Baptist. He loves Jesus more than any president has talked about in years. But he also follows the law, so he tells the IRS to go after the segregation academies. 1979, the next year, in June, Reverend Jerry Falwell founds the Moral Majority to promote traditional family values. This is the beginning of how the evangelicalism as we understand it, and the value system as we understand it. The traditional family, what's traditional family values? That's super coded language. Who's not included in that?
Everybody else.
Everybody else.
Wow.
Everybody who isn't white, straight, monogamous, 2.5 kids, woman barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, taking care of the home.
Yep. Yep. This is the beginning of that picture. Initially, they thought that what they really wanted to go after was the gay rights movement, which was sort of hitting its stride, right? This is 10 years, not quite 10 years after Stonewall. And then they realized that that abortion was the issue, because it's babies, and everybody likes babies. So it started with homosexuality is going to be our central issue. It still was a major issue, right? This is the era of Anita Bryant and all of that stuff, and whether gay people could teach in schools. So here's Paul Weyrich. I think it's Weyrich. Paul Weyrich's genius. And this is the man that I said kept all of the notes and that say we're starting this movement because of the closing of the segregation academies and the government coming after our ability to discriminate against Black people mainly. Weyrich's genius lay in his understanding that racism, the defense of racial segregation, was not likely to energize grassroots evangelical voters. So he, Falwell, and others deftly flipped the script. Instead of the religious right mobilizing in defense of segregation, doesn't poll well, evangelical leaders in the late 1970s decried government intrusion into their affairs as an assault on religious freedom, which is kind of funny. And then they wanted the government to interfere in everyone else's affairs. All right, Jerry Falwell, we've mentioned already, best known as the co-founder of the Moral Majority. Interesting guy, though. He was at the forefront of the culture wars, which you likely know, but he was also an aggressive champion of free markets. Like Strom Thurmond, he embraced libertarian rhetoric as a means of rejecting demands for racial equality without resorting to racialized rhetoric. Falwell's evolution from segregationist to libertarian was a common one. That's Gorski and Perry in their book, The Flag and the Cross, which is probably understood as the central, the best book about Christian nationalism. It's a very good book. It's on your bibliography. So Gorski and Perry, what I'm trying to do today is to sort of begin to pull some of these threads, right? One of them is the fight against integration. One of them is the realization that abortion was going to be a really important issue that people would be willing to rally around. And one of them is the free market, is capitalism. A lot of this movement, and we certainly see it now, coalesces around protection of the free market and protection of the right of companies, sort of a super libertarian. Remember that I handed out a sheet last week, and one of the things that you're being asked to interrogate is whether the phrase Christian libertarian is an oxymoron. But most of these folks would call themselves Christian libertarians. It doesn't, I don't know, for those of us who like Jesus, I don't know how they get there, but I don't find a lot in Jesus that says live and let live. Let's see, what's the next? All right, we're right up to, well, we got to the 80s. We're coming to really the movement that we have today is born at this time. What we're witnessing is the culmination of what started with the moral majority and then carried through the Reagan years. So next week we'll talk about what brings us to today, and how it really gets connected into the politics of our time. Okay? Anybody's head gonna explode?
Donna, I appreciate you laying out this history because I've forgotten a lot of it, but also the whole idea of the intelligence it took for these folks to walk through this, flipping their script, changing their meanings, and this whole path that they've been on is just amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
seriously, these were smart people trying to figure out how to get what they wanted.
Yeah, and I just don't think we can understand it if we don't go back
whether it was the
and see
lies
how we
or
got here.
everything.
Yeah. Thank you, Diane. All right, thanks everybody.